Good evening. On behalf of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission and the Ephrata Cloister Associates, welcome to this evening's Ephrata Virtual Academy. My name is Elizabeth Berthod, and I am the Historic Site Administrator at Ephrata Cloister. Tonight's program on the role of Ephrata in the American Revolution is timely. 243 years ago, the stage was being set. 256 ships transporting General Sir William Howe and his troops had departed Sandy Hook, New Jersey on July 23, 1777. They would land at the Head of Elk in Maryland on August 25th. Thus would begin the skirmishes and battles: Couch's Bridge, Brandywine, Battle of the Clouds, Paoli Massacre, Battle of Germantown, to name a few, that collectively became known as the Philadelphia Campaign. Tonight's program will be presented by Ephrata Cloister's museum educator, Michael Showalter. Michael has been involved with Ephrata since his days as a student historian. In his role as museum educator, he now oversees that program, as well as our school programs, special events, and overall site interpretation. I hope you enjoy tonight's program. We have submitted without reluctance, Ephrata Cloister and the American Revolutionary War. So if you want to take it over there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everybody, for being with us this evening. As you can see by my title slide, we have submitted without reluctance is part of a quote. Let me read you the whole quote. This is a letter written by Peter Miller. He at the time was the leader of the Ephrata community. And we're talking about the winter of 1777-78. And Miller wrote this letter about 2 years after the hospital left. He wrote this in 1780. And he says, "The winter before last, a large hospital was established at Ephrata, to which we have submitted without reluctance, being indebted to bear a proportionate share in the calamities of this present war." Ephrata was a peace-loving community and did not actively participate in the war, but felt it their Christian duty to help when called upon. And so that's how the hospital arrived at Ephrata. Not directly how it arrived, but part of the reason it's there. We'll find out more as we go along this evening, but before we get into the story of the hospital itself, I thought we better start with just a real quick review of some American history. Most folks know the Revolutionary War began with the Battle of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. Of course, everybody knows this date, Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776. And then that December at Christmas, Washington crosses the Delaware. 1777 was a year not as good for American forces and struggles. And the British recaptured Fort Ticonderoga in July of 1777. It's not a struggle that's talked about much, but the British capture of Ticonderoga opened the western part of New York State and gave the British access through the western side of New York from Canada. Of course, in a war, you want to capture the enemy's capital as the grand prize of the struggle. For the British, who the Americans were fighting, the capital was Philadelphia. And so Philadelphia was the prize. As Elizabeth mentioned, the Sir General Howe came up through the Head of Elk, through the Chesapeake Bay, landed at the Head of Elk, and started marching toward Philadelphia. On this map of the period, I have Philadelphia marked down here, sort of to the lower right, with a big blue star. I hope you can spot that. The first encounter where the Americans tried to stop the advance by the British on Philadelphia occurred at the Battle of Brandywine on September 11, 1777. Just about 2 weeks later, there was something known as the Paoli Massacre. Again, the Americans fought the British at the Battle of Germantown on October 4th, 1777. The end result was America lost all of those struggles, and the British spent the winter in Philadelphia, and the Americans retreated to Valley Forge for the winter. The Battle of Brandywine, September 11th. Well, it's hard to come up with exact numbers, but these were some that I found to give us a sense of American losses in this one struggle. About 200 American forces were killed. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 750 men were wounded. But even before this battle, there had been a report of the sick within the Army in August of that year. And that August report said of roughly 35,000 men, 1,800 of them were sick before this battle even occurred. So already Washington's starting with a little bit of loss. And then the Battle of Germantown, October 1777. Again, the sense of losses for America, roughly 152 killed, 521 wounded. You see the large numbers of wounded combined with that large number of sick already in the Army meant for a bit of struggle for the medical department of the armies that winter. Of course, there was no plan as to where these battles would be held, so after the battles, all sorts of structures were used as temporary field hospitals. Stables and barns and churches, taverns, schoolhouses, and even private homes. This illustration does come from the Civil War, but I think it gives you a good sense of what a barn looks like after it's been converted into an emergency hospital following a battle. As I mentioned, Washington and the struggling American troops retreated to Valley Forge for that winter. But what about all those sick men in the barns and the churches and those even tents as temporary hospitals? Where did they go for the winter? Well, while Washington's safe at Valley Forge, the doctors are trying their best to address the needs of the sick and wounded men. One doctor of the time, Dr. James Tilton, wrote later, "It would be shocking to humanity to relate the history of our general hospitals in the years 1777 and 78. Let's go back to this map. I have that little red house down there at Philadelphia. The British are there, and the blue house, well, that's Valley Forge, where Washington and the healthy men are spending the winter time. To the right, you'll see a yellow house, and that's Princeton. There was a hospital already in existence at Princeton. And then to the very top of the page, you'll see another yellow little house. That's Bethlehem. There was a military hospital that had been established at Bethlehem earlier. Both the Princeton and the Bethlehem hospitals were a result of earlier fighting that had occurred in northern New Jersey. The Bethlehem Hospital actually thought they were going to close in the summer of 1777 before all this fighting in the southern part of the colony began, or the state, I should say at this point, and they had to reopen. Off to the left, you'll see a green box on this map, and that's Mannheim, here in Lancaster County. It was one of the main storehouses for medical supplies for the Army that winter. How did hospitals get added to this map? Well, Washington was concerned about the Princeton Hospital. It was already crowded, and he was afraid the men may be open for further British attack. So a hospital was established at Easton. Another was created at Northumberland, what today we would know as Allentown. And then one in Reading. Another hospital created in those days, Heidelberg, present-day Schaefferstown in Lebanon County. Reamstown here in Lancaster County had a hospital, seems to only have had men in it for about 5-6 weeks or so in the early part of 1778. The records talk about something called Three Churches Warwick. I'm really a bit mystified by this, but after a lot of research, I think there may be 3 church buildings, but only 2 congregations. It looks like the Lutheran congregation at Brickerville today, the town of Brickerville, and had 2 church buildings, and the Reformed congregation, just barely a block away, had 1 church building. So that's how we get 3 churches, Warwick, and that's Warwick Township they're in. A hospital was established in the Dutch Reformed Church in Mannheim. The largest hospital here in Lancaster County was at Lidditz, in the Moravian community at Lidditz. Another hospital established in Lancaster itself, and finally the hospital at Ephrata, which we'll talk more about. After these hospitals were all established, later in January, some other hospitals were established closer to Valley Forge, one at French Creek, another at Euclid, and there was another smaller one very close by at a place called Redland, or today it's Red Lion. And finally that winter, the largest of all the military hospitals was constructed at Yellow Springs. This became the permanent military hospital for the remainder of the American Revolutionary War. So here you can see those hospitals scattered throughout southeastern Pennsylvania. It's estimated that the population among these householders, or among these hospitals, was approximately 2,800 men. And then there could have been another 2,000 men scattered somewhere in smaller buildings and private homes. So we're looking at 4,800, almost 5,000 men in these hospitals in this winter. Now, this is what we often think of when we think of colonial medicine: leeches and bloodletting and pretty scary sounding things. But actually, these things don't seem to appear much in the records, at least not in the hospitals in Lancaster County. Records are a little scarce, and I'll talk about that later, but it appears that for Lancaster County hospitals, the men who were sent out here came with diseases, not so much of battle wounds, bullet wounds, bayonet stabs, and the like. Those seem to have been directed toward Bethlehem and toward the north from the region, the battle regions. And to the west came those men needing care for their illnesses. The best of all British hospitals to do training in the period was the Edinburgh Hospital. Sir John Pringle was one of the doctors there, and Pringle had actually worked with the British Army in battles in Europe, and he published a book called Observations on the Diseases of Armies. This became sort of a textbook for those American doctors who were now confronted with dealing with battle wounds. Most American doctors, however, could not afford to go to Edinburgh to learn their trade. Some did, but many American doctors were going by the simpler route of becoming an apprentice, finding a skilled doctor, working with him for a number of years, learning the occupation. There was a medical school in America. It had opened in 1765, just 10 years before the fighting began. It's now known as the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And the brick building I'm showing you here, sort of off in the distance in this sketch, is the first hospital training center for doctors in America. And there was a little book that had come out in America, published by John Jones, a doctor from New York, called Practical and Concise Remarks on the Care of Wounds and Fractures. So another sort of how-to manual when addressing some of those battle injuries for American doctors. And the American doctors were actually attached initially to specific military units. Later, they were all reorganized into their own medical department, but they still had close affiliations with their own specific military units. They were not going into the field empty-handed. There was an apothecary general. He was responsible for supplying and managing the flow of medicines to all the doctors out in the fields, and the doctors were all sent out with medicine chests full of all sorts of medicines and supplies. The medical knowledge was, of course, not what we have today, but they had certain herbal remedies that were often prescribed. One of them is something known as jalap. It comes from the root of a plant grown in Mexico. Now, it is a cathartic. They knew its action, and so they freely prescribed that. And then a most popular prescription of the period goes by a couple different names: Jesuit's bark, Peruvian bark. It was discovered in Peru by Jesuit missionaries, being used by the Native Americans there as a healing plant. It contains quinine. They didn't know the scientific name quinine or what was scientifically going on when they were using it, but they knew it helped to treat certain illnesses. I'm showing you here the Brothers' house at Lidditz, Pennsylvania. This is the Brothers for the Moravian single men. And this is the building that was used as the military hospital at Lidditz. And while the hospital was in effect there at Lidditz, the winter of 1777-78, Dr. Brown, who was in charge of the hospital, was responsible for publishing the first American Pharmacopoeia, the first listing of actual drugs being used in America. The whole book is in Latin, as any good doctor of the period, they didn't have trouble, but I'm afraid I was struggling with this book. I turned to the Civil War again to find one more illustration to share with you, and that is transportation. So Ephrata, Lidditz, Lancaster County, we're 60, 70 miles from these battles. How did the men get here from those temporary field hospitals where they were staying? In wagons. These are covered wagons, but we're told that the men who arrived at Ephrata about December 18th or 19th of 1777, they arrived in the evening in open wagons. And the wagoners had no instructions what to do with the men once they arrived at Ephrata. One witness said the men crawled off the wagons into people's front doors begging for assistance. This was a winter of great struggle for Americans. All sorts of supplies were needed desperately, and that same theme will return in our story again. And what did they bring them to at Ephrata? Well, unfortunately, the buildings used as the hospital at Ephrata no longer survive. They stood on a hill known as Mount Zion, just to the sort of southeastern edge of our property. And these two buildings, which do survive at the site, the Sisters' House, or Sarin, on the left, built in 1743, and the Meeting House, or Zoll, on the right, built in 1741, these two large buildings probably resemble very closely what the buildings on Mount Zion look like. We've done archaeology at the site of the buildings on Mount Zion, so that gives us a little clue as to what those buildings may have looked like, along with some other period descriptions. You might wonder, why did they bring them all this distance? Well, here's one answer. Lancaster County was the breadbasket of the colonies. This was and still is a very strong agricultural region. And it was here where all sorts of supplies it was hoped could be found to feed and care for these men that winter. Lancaster County also had these large buildings. I'm showing you at the top here, all of the buildings attached to the Moravian congregation at Lidditz. Right in the very center is their church building, and to the right of it, the pink building with sort of this squarish kind of roof, is the Brothers' house that I showed you a photograph of earlier. That was the main building used as the hospital. The other thing we had out here in Lancaster County was a large number of people who chose not to actively participate in the war effort. We have a lot of Anabaptists, Brethren, Mennonite, Amish people living in Lancaster County, and they, like the people of Ephrata, are peace-loving people. They're not actively combatants in wars, and so they chose not to participate. But like Peter Miller in his earlier letter, they're willing to do their Christian duty when called upon to do that job. And so these are some reasons the doctors may have chosen the locations in Lancaster County to be hospitals. Going inside that surviving meeting house at Ephrata, this is probably very similar to what the meeting house would have looked like on Mount Zion, where the hospital was located. Straw would have been spread on the floor, the benches and table would have been taken out, and the men would have laid upon the straw as their beds. What do you see missing in this room? Now keep in mind, it's January, it's February, it's the bitter cold of winter. Any heat sources? Well, that was fairly common for large church areas and buildings such as this in the 18th century. No real direct source of heat. So we know that winter, the doctors installed 2 stoves in the buildings on Mount Zion. And this is a picture of a stove that was actually made just a few years before the war started, made about 9 miles from Ephrata. And I can't say for certain that this is the kind of stove that the doctors put in the room, but I think it's a good chance this strongly resembles the stoves that would have been installed by the doctors that winter. As I mentioned, the men lay upon the straw, and the man in charge of the hospital at Ephrata was Dr. Moses Scott. He was born in Pennsylvania, but just prior to the war, he had opened a new office of his in New Brunswick, New Jersey. His home and office no longer stand. The location of them is now the location for the headquarters of Johnson & Johnson. I find that an interesting irony. At Ephrata, it was Peter Miller who was in charge of the hospital. And Miller is the one who wrote that letter I mentioned early on. These 2 men supervised together the both sides of the hospital activity at Ephrata. For Dr. Scott, he was assisted by Drs. Yackel, Dr. Smith, and Dr. Harrison. There's a bit of conflict in the records, but it appears that younger Dr. Harrison may have actually died at Ephrata. Peter Miller was helping to supervise the few remaining celibate brothers and sisters living at Ephrata. Probably about 25 or 30 of those celibate members, a much smaller number than the 80 or so at the community's height back in the 1750s. And those brothers and sisters served as nurses. They had no real special medical training. That was left to Dr. Scott and the other doctors, but they certainly knew how to do some cooking, do some laundry, emptying chamber pots, digging graves. Those were the kind of things that were left to the brothers and sisters to assist with that winter. I mentioned earlier that it seems to be disease that came to Lancaster County. The most deadly of those diseases was known at the time as camp fever or jail fever. They recognized the symptoms, and they appeared whenever they seemed to put people together, crowded together in small spaces. Anyone infected in their first 1 to 3 weeks of infection, they began to develop a fever, malaise, headache, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Well, this sounds like a wide number of different ailments that it could be. But in about 5 to 9 days after the symptoms begin to appear, a rash begins to appear on the person. Usually starts sort of in the chest and moves upward and out, across the shoulders, down to the back. Here's a modern photograph of someone suffering from this disease. Not only is it a rash, a reddish area, but you develop all of these pustules, these little bubbles all over the skin. And once those start to appear, well, another week or 2 goes by and the patient becomes sensitive to light, delirium, their temperature keeps rising. There's no modern drugs to address the rise in temperature. Coma sets in, and eventually it often leads to death. How were those doctors to treat this disease? Well, again, they don't have science as we do today, and so they treated the symptoms they saw in front of them. They recognized that a weak person doesn't want to eat a lot, so they're giving them a very moderate, very, very simple, almost pale sort of a diet. A lot of rice is mentioned in the records, broth, a thin broth, and then stimulants, since they seem to be lagging. Coffee, alcohol, wine especially is mentioned, and chocolate appears in the list of stores in the Ephrata Hospital. Of course, chocolate has a little bit of caffeine, a little bit of stimulant in it. There was something about vinegar. They knew that that vinegar, that acidic nature of vinegar, seemed to help combat the disease. They didn't quite know why, but it was helping to alleviate some of the suffering, as was lime juice. There's a lot of discussion in the records about lime juice. I have no idea where they were getting it, because it certainly was an imported item, and the British seem to have controlled a lot of the East Coast, but lime juice seems to be mentioned a lot as a needed element to add to the diet. Today, we recognize this disease as something called typhus. And here's the culprit: lice. Now, this big close-up of a louse doesn't really help you put this in perspective. There's that louse laying on top of a dime. Remember, the men are laying on straw on the floor. It's like playgrounds for the lice. Dr. Scott had been at the Bethlehem Hospital before he came to Ephrata, and he accounts that prior to coming to Ephrata, he was told in Bethlehem the straw should be changed after every fourth man lays upon it. That means the first man who was there may have died. Second may have recovered and gone back to the army. Third man, maybe he wasn't well enough to return to the army, but he was sent home. Maybe the fourth man died upon that straw. And then finally, the fifth man gets new straw again. Can you see why this lice running around in the straw is just continuously spreading this typhus disease? It wasn't only men in the cloister building itself at Ephrata. People were taking soldiers into their own homes. About a mile and a half from the site of Ephrata community was the home of a Mennonite couple, Johannes and Anna Baer. They took wounded and sick men into their home to care for them. Remember I mentioned earlier on, we had people in the neighborhood willing to do their Christian duty. Unfortunately, Johannes caught the camp fever and the typhus disease. He died in March of 1778, and about 2 weeks later, his wife also died. Ephrata had a printing press. They had done a lot of work for themselves, but much work for outside customers. I'm showing you here the largest book published in America prior to the Revolutionary War. It's called the Martyrs Mirror. It was done at the request of Mennonites, and it tells the story of early Anabaptist and Mennonite leaders and founders and their willingness to sacrifice their lives in defense of their faith. It's the story of the founders of the Mennonite faith, and it's still a very valued book among the Mennonite faith today. But by the time of the American Revolution, Ephrata, who produced this volume, still had about 300 copies of the book sitting in their warehouse, hadn't been sold. I mentioned needing all sorts of supplies, not only food, not only blankets and clothing, but paper. So the army took those 300 copies, began to cut the pages into little slips that were used as gun cartridges. They were turned into little tubes of paper that held a bullet and gunpowder, and the soldiers carried these onto the battlefield, ripped them open, dumped the contents into their guns, and the paper becomes trash. Well, when the Anabaptists heard about the use of this book as cartridges, they said, "You're turning our martyr book into a murder book." Their protests were heard by the American government, who took the books, put them in a warehouse in Philadelphia, and kept them there for about 10 years. In 1787, they were sold back to Anabaptists in Pennsylvania, and we think we now know of about 10 copies that have returned from this war experience. There could be more out there we're not acquainted with yet. Earlier on, I had passed to some folks a little teaser asking you what happened to Send Night and what is a Send Night at Ephrata. Well, here's a bit of 18th century vocabulary for you. Most folks are familiar with a fortnight as being 2 weeks. A Send Night is 1 week. And this ad appeared in the March 1778 newspaper. It says, Monday se'nnight, or a week ago, a handsome donation was received at Ephrata for the use of the sick and wounded of the hospital at that place, sent from the charitable and well-disposed Presbyterian congregation at the forks of the Brandywine, a laudable example worthy of imitation. The medical gentlemen take this public method in the name of the sick and wounded to return their most hearty and unfeigned thanks to the good people who so generously contributed so sensibly and seasonably in this manner. The Forks of the Brandywine Presbyterian congregation is outside Downingtown, a good 25 or so, maybe more miles from Ephrata. Why did they send this donation all this distance? And of all those other hospitals they could have sent it to, why Ephrata? I haven't quite figured the answer to this question yet, but the one clue I might pursue is this fact that Dr. Moses Scott was not only a medical man, he was a very faithful man, and he was an elder in the Presbyterian Church back in his home congregation in New Jersey. I'm wondering if he had some church connections that earned this donation at Ephrata. Dr. Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia had been involved with helping to care for soldiers and working with the Army. He published a little pamphlet called The Directions for Addressing the Health of Soldiers. And these were Dr. Rush's recommendations for healthy men in the Army. He said, first, get them out of wool uniforms in the middle of summer. Second, give them a good diet. This was really a big struggle that winter of 77-78 because so many supplies were short. He says, make them take a bath at least once a week. Keep them clean. Make them cut their hair. Well, longer hair pulled back in a little ponytail or queue of the 18th century was the common fashion for men. He says, cut that off. He says, pay attention to how you lay out your camp. Well, at one place, they made the mistake of putting the latrines on the top of the hill and the camping men were at the bottom of the hill. Didn't work so well. He also says, keep those men active while they're at camp, even in the middle of winter. Make them march, make them drill, make them chop firewood, anything to keep them busy and exercised. These were Rush's recommendations for creating a healthy soldier in the Army. In that letter I first started with, Peter Miller also says that the doctors addressed what he calls, quote, the vices attached to soldier life, end quote, at Ephrata. I have no real specific idea what he means, but at the archaeology done at the site of the Ephrata Hospital, we found a large number of tobacco pipes. It's the only site on the entire Ephrata Cloister property where tobacco usage is evident. We also found 2 dice. Maybe that's the vice which Miller was referring to. Ironically, one of the dice in the pair was found in archaeology in the 1960s. The other die was found in the early 2000s. How do we know some of what we know about the hospitals that winter? I mentioned records were very scarce. Dr. Scott says that when he was at Bethlehem, before coming to Ephrata, the soldiers arrived from the battlefield so quickly and there was such confusion, he could not account for all the men, and he felt that there was never going to be a full accounting of all the men at all of the hospitals. Today, we only know of one list that mentions some men's names, and that's at the Lidditz Hospital, but it's also not a complete list. We're pretty certain of that. The man I'm showing you here, Captain Lachlan Mcintosh, was sent by George Washington in April of 1778 to inspect the hospitals. Washington was getting ready to return to battle in 1778. He needed to know how many men were still out there sick and how many men were fit to march. That was Mcintosh's order. Get a census of the men. How many men are out there? How many men are fit for battle? I want to return to this map because, and I'm going to read you right from Lachlan Mcintosh's report. This is how he addresses the hospitals in his report. And I want you to follow this. My red line I'm going to draw here actually is following the roads on this 18th century map. I think this is probably the route that Mcintosh was taking. His first entry in his report covers the hospital at Princeton, and then he mentions the hospital at Easton. From there, Bethlehem, Northumberland, or Allentown. He then talks about the hospital at Schaefferstown or Heidelberg. He mentions the hospitals at Schaefferstown, the one at Mannheim, Lidditz, the three churches, Warwick, and that's where I get that reference, and he ends with Ephrata. I suspect, I don't know this, but looking at the map, I suspect from Ephrata, he returned to Valley Forge. He says that he's not going to include reports on the hospitals closest to Valley Forge, the one at French Creek, the Yellow Springs Hospital, the Euclid Hospital. He says they will send their own reports directly to the commander at Valley Forge. Another source of our information comes in a roundabout way from this man, Dr. John Morgan. Dr. Morgan is one of those doctors that had been educated in Europe, and he had been teaching at the University of Pennsylvania prior to the war. Early on in the struggle, he was appointed the deputy general, sort of the man in charge of all the Army hospitals. But he didn't seem to have a lot of tact with with Congress, and he made some political enemies. He was removed as the Director General and replaced by this man, William Shippen. William Shippen had also been educated in Europe. He also had been a teacher at the University of Pennsylvania prior to the war. And Shippen and Morgan were enemies with one another. They just never seemed to get along. And Shippen's presence, taking over that job in charge of the hospitals, I think didn't sit too well with Morgan. And when the winter of 1777-78 was over, Morgan was able to use some few political connections he had and bring Shippen up for a court-martial. Shippen was charged with selling hospital stores and making a personal profit. He was charged with watering down the wine at the Bethlehem Hospital. He was charged with neglect, and he was charged with conduct unbecoming a gentleman. The court-martial occurred in early 1780, and it's because of the court-martial that we have Peter Miller's letter. He wrote the letter in defense of Shippen's actions that winter. Eventually, at the end of the court-martial, Shippen was acquitted of all his charges, but then the Congress reorganized the whole hospital arrangements, and Shippen then resigned his commission. Morgan really wasn't content with the fact that Shippen was acquitted of all the charges, and so he took all the depositions and court testimony presented in the court-martial, and he published them all in the Philadelphia newspaper. In some ways, this may sound a little bit like our modern politics, but those court-martial testimonies give us a lot of the information. That reference to the stoves being put in, for example, comes from one of those testimonies, as does the information about Johannes and Anna Baer. Their son testified. At Ephrata, there was a total of about 260 men brought to the site, and about 60 of them died there. The hospital opened about December the 19th of 1777, the same time Washington arrives at Valley Forge, and it closed sometime in the second or third week of June of 1778. So roughly 6 months the hospital was located there. Those 60 or so men who died at Ephrata were buried in one large mass grave on the Mount Zion Cemetery. And tradition tells us that it's Peter Miller who placed a wooden board at the spot of the grave. It says, "Hier ruhe de Gebeine von vielen Soltern." That board still survives in the collection of our Historical Society of the Cocalico Valley, just a block from the cloister. But eventually, that board was removed and replaced with a granite monument. The monument wasn't placed until 1902. And on one side, it says, "Sacred to the memory of the patriotic soldiers of the American Revolution who fought at the Battle of Brandywine, September 11th, 1777. About 500 of the sick and wounded were brought to Ephrata for treatment. Several hundred died who were buried in this consecrated ground." Unfortunately, many legends have grown up about the hospital and the winter experiences at Ephrata that year. And the monument has now carved some of those legends into stone. It says the men at Ephrata's hospital fought in the Battle of Brandywine. That's true, they may have, but they may have also fought at Yorktown. They may have been at Paoli, or they could have been at a couple of other skirmishes that occurred that winter. It says about 500 of the sick were brought to Ephrata. Well, Mcintosh's report only accounts for about 260 men. And while the monument says several hundred died, again, looking at the materials we have available for us today, it appears only 60 men are buried in Mount Zion Cemetery. Another side of the monument says, "More than a century, the remains of these patriots rested in this hallowed spot without any commemoration except the following words on a plain wooden board." In German, "Hier ruhe die Gebeine von vielen Soltern." A translation would be, "Here rest the bodies of many soldiers." Of course, you all know how the war ended, but we can't forget the sacrifices of both the soldiers who fought on the front line and the sacrifices of the people behind the lines who helped care and support them. Ephrata's hospital and the people around the neighborhood of Ephrata were some of those people who helped in the cause for American independence. Thank you so much for spending your time with me this evening, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions that there may be.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. It was very interesting. We do have a couple of questions that have come through. Is the Rev War Cemetery still evident at the cloister?
Oh, yes. Well, I showed you that monument that was put up in 1902. We actually have two cemeteries on the Ephrata Cloister site. We have the one where the monument is located, known as the Mount Zion Cemetery, and there are some of the other cloister, later German Seventh-day Baptist Church members buried there. And we have an earlier cemetery called God's Acre, which contains most of the celibate members.
And another question that came in have any hereditary societies marked the graves?
Well, certainly you see the big marker that's up at Mount Zion Cemetery. There are 2 or 3 individual stones marked at the Mount Zion Cemetery, but I'm not sure those people have any direct connection to that Mount Zion Cemetery. As time went on, that cemetery became somewhat of a public cemetery. In the cemetery containing the celibates, there's one of the married members of the community of the 18th century whose grave is marked with a marker from the Daughters of the American Revolution. However, that particular individual never served in the war. At the time the marker was placed, they were using some sort of faulty records, just like the monument has some mistakes in it. We now know that he never served, but I really like the fact that the marker is there because it shows us the continued need for ongoing research.
Okay, let's see, we have one more here I see. How long were the soldiers being cared for at Ephrata? And then this is a two-parter. Were there any Hessian prisoners?
Okay, so the hospital opened about December 19th, 77, and then closed sometime in the middle of June of 78. We can't put an exact date on that. There was a traveling minister. He was there at the beginning of June, and when he got back at the end of June, the hospital had gone. So roughly 6 months. As far as we know, there were no Hessians at Ephrata. We know that there was a Hessian prisoner of war barracks in Lancaster. Some of those Hessians were put out for hire, if you will, to do labor. Not far from us is the Elizabeth Furnace, where Hessian prisoners of war were used to dig a ditch to keep the water running to operate the furnace bellows. And we know of a farm about maybe a mile and a half from the cloister. We know there were 2 of those Hessians employed on that farm that winter. We're not aware of any Hessians at Ephrata.
Thank you, Michael. I'm not seeing any more. So at this point, I would like to thank everyone for attending this evening. Is there any? Nope,
Thank
nope,
you
that's
very
not
much.
just, got a lot of thank yous coming in. Everyone seems to have enjoyed the program. Thank you again, everyone, for attending this evening. This has been recorded and will be posted on Historic Ephrata Cloister's YouTube channel in the next few days. We will also be following up by sending out a short survey about this program. Help us improve our virtual programs by completing this survey. Our next Ephrata Virtual Academy will be held on September 10th at 7 p.m. and our presenter will be Lydia Jones, and she will be comparing the Ephrata community with the Shakers. Anyone who gives tours at Ephrata knows that that is the most frequent comparison that our visitors make. So I hope you'll stay tuned and sign on to participate in that one as well. Information about this will be posted on our website in, if not already, in the next couple days. Again, thank you all for participating. Have a good rest of your evening.